April 1945. Somewhere in southern Germany, beyond the last broken tree lines of the collapsing Reich, a wire fence catches the early morning light. The sun passes through its metal grid and falls onto a gravel yard in hard, geometric shadows. Inside the enclosure, rows of young women stand shoulder to shoulder. 200 of them, maybe more. Their gray Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms are still intact, pressed, buttoned, disciplined despite weeks of retreat, surrender, and transport. They do not speak. They listen. Boots move across the gravel. An American processing unit has arrived. Not with weapons raised, but with clipboards, crates, and routine precision. At the edge of the yard, supplies are unloaded. Among them are items the women do not recognize as instruments of war: bars of soap, folded towels, plain clothing stacked by size. For years, these women were told that this moment would end differently, that capture meant violation, brutality, death, that American soldiers were predators, not administrators, that surrender erased dignity forever. Now they wait, hungry, exhausted, and braced for the inevitable. And then the order comes, not shouted, not cruel, not dramatic. They are to step forward, one by one, to wash, to change, to begin again without the uniform that defined them. It is a moment so ordinary, so procedural, that it becomes unbearable. Because in its quiet efficiency, everything they believed about the enemy begins to collapse. The origins of that belief were shaped long before this fence was ever built. Asterisk. To understand why a bar of soap and a towel could feel more unsettling than violence, it is necessary to return years earlier, before surrender, before captivity, before the wire fences, into the ideological machinery that shaped these women long before the war began to end. From the moment the National Socialist state consolidated power in the 1930s, the German population was subjected to an information environment engineered for total obedience. Propaganda was not supplemental to governance. It was governance. Cinema, radio, print, education, and youth organizations worked in unison to construct a moral universe in which enemies were not merely adversaries, but existential threats, subhuman, degenerate, and irredeemably cruel for German women. This ideological conditioning took a specific form. They were told they were both guardians and instruments of the Reich, mothers of the future, supporters of the present. Their primary battlefield was not the front line, but endurance, maintaining order, discipline, and belief. As the war expanded beyond Germany's capacity to sustain it, when war broke out in September 1939, women were initially excluded from direct military structures. Nazi ideology publicly upheld traditional gender roles. Combat was masculine, sacrifice was feminine. But as the war dragged on, first across Europe, then deep into the Soviet Union, then against the industrial weight of the United States, this separation became impossible to maintain. By 1940, the Wehrmacht quietly began recruiting women into auxiliary services. They were known collectively as Wehrmacht. Many were young, some barely out of school. They were assigned to communications, logistics, clerical work, radar stations, and anti-aircraft coordination. Others served in the Luftwaffe as signals operators or meteorological assistants. A smaller number worked near the front as medical aides, though always under strict non-combat definitions. They wore uniforms. They held ranks. They swore oaths of loyalty not to Germany, but to Adolf Hitler personally. This oath mattered. It bound identity to obedience. To betray the Reich was not simply to lose a war, it was to lose oneself. Training for these women was not physically brutal, but it was psychologically rigorous. Discipline was emphasized. Silence under pressure. Emotional restraint. But woven into the curriculum was something far more corrosive, a constant fixation on what would happen if they failed. Instructional films, lectures, and warnings described capture in vivid, relentless detail. The enemy, particularly the Americans, was portrayed not as a lawful army, but as a criminal horde. German women were told that American soldiers were descendants of gangsters and frontier violence, men without culture, without restraint, without mercy. Capture, they were taught, would mean sexual violence, public humiliation, and death. This messaging intensified as Germany's strategic position worsened. By 1943, after Stalingrad and the Allied landings in Italy, the tone shifted from triumph to fatalism. Survival was no longer promised. honor was. Women were told explicitly that death was preferable to surrender. That dignity could only be preserved through refusal. Some women were issued cyanide capsules. Others were instructed in suicide protocols. Even those who were not formally equipped absorbed the message clearly enough: do not fall into enemy hands. Yet reality intruded faster than ideology could. Adapt by late 1944 and early 1945, the Reich was collapsing on all fronts. Allied armies pushed east from France. Soviet forces crushed through Poland and into Germany itself. Communications failed. Units dissolved. Entire formations vanished without orders or explanation. Women stationed at radar posts or switchboards suddenly found themselves abandoned, officers gone, transport destroyed, retreat routes cut. Surrender became unavoidable. Surrendering to American forces was not a strategic decision. It was a moment of sheer exhaustion, hunger, fear, dislocation. They expected execution, abuse, or disappearance. Some braced for death. Others simply shut down, emotionally hollowed by years of conditioning that offered no framework for survival in defeat. What awaited them instead was something they had never been trained to understand: a system, not mercy, not forgiveness procedure, and that system had its own rules, its own laws, and its own ideas about what captivity was meant to accomplish. Those rules would soon define every step they took beyond the fence. The system these women stepped into had not been designed for them specifically. It had been constructed years earlier, shaped by a different war, a different memory, and a different fear for the United States and its Western allies. The treatment of prisoners of war was not merely a humanitarian concern, it was a strategic one. The First World War had left deep institutional scars. Stories of mistreated prisoners, retaliatory violence, and moral collapse had circulated widely in the interwar years. By the time the Second World War began, American military planners were determined, at least on paper, not to repeat those failures. The legal foundation was the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war, which the United States ratified in 1932. Its provisions were clear. Captured enemy personnel were to be disarmed, identified, housed, fed, and protected. They were not criminals. They were not hostages. They were wards of the detaining power, to be held until the end of hostilities and then repatriated as American forces expanded across North Africa, Italy, France, and finally into Germany itself. This framework became operational doctrine. Entire units were trained not only to fight, but to process surrender. POW handling manuals specified procedures down to the smallest detail: searching, registration, delousing, medical inspection, segregation by rank and gender, and transfer to reararia camps by female prisoners presented logistical complications, but not conceptual ones. They were treated as a subset of POS, requiring additional safeguards. Separate housing, female guards, or medical personnel were available. Strict rules governing contact with male soldiers. Hygiene protocols that reflected both health concerns and cultural sensitivities. By 1944, American POW processing had become almost industrial in scale. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers surrendered in the wake of the Normandy breakout and the collapse of the Western Front. Temporary enclosures, barbed wire compounds hastily erected in fields, forests, and former military installations were established to receive them. These were known as Reinwasenlager in Germany and transit camps elsewhere in Europe. The system was imperfect. Overcrowding was common. Supplies were sometimes delayed. Conditions varied widely depending on location and timing, but the underlying principle remained consistent. Prisoners were to be kept alive, healthy enough to work, and compliant. For German women captured in the spring of 1945, this approach was profoundly disorienting. They were searched, but not assaulted, questioned, but not threatened, issued identification numbers, but not stripped of dignity, at least not intentionally. Their uniforms were catalogued, their personal belongings recorded, their physical condition assessed by medical staff who spoke through interpreters and worked from checklists. Delousing was mandatory, not as punishment, but as policy. Typhus and lice were among the greatest threats to Allied forces moving through devastated regions. Prisoners, male and female alike, were required to bathe, surrender infested clothing, and receive clean garments or temporary coverings. Soap and towels were standard issue, as mundane to the system as rations or blankets. To American personnel, this was routine. To the women standing in line, it was surreal. Nothing in their training had prepared them for an enemy that behaved like an administrator. There were no shouted insults, no theatrical cruelty, no effort to humiliate beyond what procedure required. The officers overseeing the process were often distant, even bored, focused on paperwork and flow rates rather than individuals. Some of the women were transported further west, away from the collapsing front lines. Others were sent across the Atlantic to the United States itself, part of a little-known POW relocation program designed to relieve pressure on European facilities. Camps in places like Texas, Arizona, Louisiana, and Pennsylvania built for Axis soldiers captured in North Africa were adapted to house women, as well there the pattern continued. Barracks, roll calls, meals, work assignments. Red Cross inspections, letters home when permitted. The monotony of captivity replaced the terror. They had been taught to expect, yet it was precisely this monotony that proved destabilizing, because every clean towel, every bar of soap, every medically supervised procedure quietly contradicted years of ideological certainty. The enemy was not behaving as the Reich had promised. The narrative that had sustained them through loyalty and fear no longer aligned with lived experience, and as these contradictions accumulated, they produced something more dangerous than despair. They produced doubt. That doubt would soon surface in different ways, psychological, moral, and institutional depending on who was observing. And from which side of the fence, the moment soap and towels were issued did not mean the same thing to everyone who witnessed it. Its meaning fractured along lines of experience, belief, and responsibility. To understand why this single act resonated so deeply, it must be examined from multiple angles, each revealing a different layer of the same event. The human angle for the women standing in line, the experience was not relief. It was disorientation. Their bodies reacted before their minds could. Hands hesitated when towels were offered. Some women froze, unsure whether accepting them was permitted or whether it concealed a trap. Others moved mechanically, stripped of initiative by years of obedience training. The act of undressing, mandated, supervised, procedural, was not interpreted as violence, but it was not neutral either. Clothing had been armor. The uniform had provided structure, belonging, and purpose. Removing it felt like erasure. For many, this was the first moment they confronted defeat, not as an abstract national failure, but as a personal one. Without insignia, without rank, without symbols, they were no longer auxiliaries of the Reich. They were simply bodies in a system that did not recognize their former identities. The shock came not from mistreatment, but from the absence of expected cruelty. The emotional script they had rehearsed for years no longer applied. The psychological angle what unfolded was a textbook case of cognitive dissonance. Nazi propaganda had provided a closed moral universe. Americans were monsters. Surrender meant annihilation. Survival through capture was impossible. This belief system had been reinforced through repetition, authority, and fear. It had sustained loyalty even as defeat became inevitable. The POW processing line dismantled that system quietly and efficiently. No argument was made, no counter-propaganda delivered. Instead, the contradiction was lived. Clean water, soap, medical examinations, neutral faces. These details undermined the core narrative, not through persuasion, but through experience. Psychologically, this was destabilizing. Belief systems collapse, not when they are challenged, but when they become irrelevant. The women were forced to reconcile to incompatible realities, the enemy they had been taught to fear, and the one standing in front of them, clipboard in hand. Many experienced shame not because they had surrendered, but because they had believed so completely. The American soldier angle from the other side of the process. The scene looked entirely different. The American personnel assigned to POW handling were not there to make moral statements. They had been trained to follow procedure, search, register, separate, clean, feed, move on. For most, the women in line were not symbols of Nazism or victims of propaganda. They were a logistical category requiring attention and compliance. Strict rules governed conduct. Fraternization was prohibited. Physical contact was limited to necessity. Professional distance was enforced not only to prevent abuse, but to avoid emotional entanglement. The soldiers and officers overseeing the process understood that discipline was the foundation of control. Soap and towels were not kindness. They were tools. Tools to prevent disease, to maintain order, to process large numbers efficiently. The fact that they carried psychological weight for the prisoners was incidental, and that in that very indifference lay their power, because it demonstrated something the Reich had never acknowledged, that power did not require cruelty to function, that realization emerging differently for captor and captive, alike set the stage for deeper moral and institutional consequences that extended far beyond the processing yard. If the first reactions unfolded on a human and psychological level, the deeper implications of the moment became visible only when viewed through broader lenses: systems, ethics, and comparison. What happened in that yard was not accidental. It was the result of deliberate choices made far from the fence line. The institutional angle, the Allied POW system, was built to function without emotional variance. It did not depend on mercy, nor did it reward cruelty. Its strength lay in predictability. Every prisoner moved through the same sequence: registration, inspection, sanitation, housing, labor assignment. Soap and towels were as integral to that sequence as barbed wire and guard towers. This bureaucratic neutrality was intentional. American military doctrine held that prisoners who were treated consistently were easier to manage, less likely to resist, and less vulnerable to disease or unrest. Hygiene was not cosmetic. It was preventative medicine, discipline, and control combined. For female POS, this system carried additional safeguards. Separation from male prisoners reduced risk. Medical examinations were documented. Inspections by the International Committee of the Red Cross provided oversight. Abuse, while not impossible, was institutionally discouraged and punishable. The system was designed to outlast individuals and restrain impulses on both sides. In that sense, the towel was not an act of compassion. It was a symbol of institutional authority, asserting itself through order rather than fear. The morality inevitably crept in, even where it was not invited. For the women who had expected degradation, the absence of it forced a moral reckoning. They had been taught that the enemy's restraint was weakness, that cruelty was proof of strength. But here was a system that exercised absolute power over bodies' movement, identity without humiliation. This challenged the moral hierarchy they had internalized. If the enemy could control without cruelty, what did that say about the system they had served, about the values they had defended? For some, the realization was immediate and crushing. For others, it surfaced slowly, buried beneath routine until it could no longer be ignored. On the American side, morality was institutionalized rather than personalized. Individual soldiers were discouraged from interpreting their role as righteous or punitive. They were executing policy. The moral claim of the system rested not on emotional superiority, but on adherence to law. This detachment did not erase moral meaning, it reframed it. Power expressed through restraint carried its own weight. The enemy comparison angle, the contrast became unavoidable when compared to experiences elsewhere in the collapsing Reich. German women captured by Soviet forces encountered a radically different reality. The Eastern Front had been a war of annihilation, shaped by racial ideology, revenge, and staggering loss. Discipline collapsed alongside infrastructure. Mass violence, deportations, and sexual assault were widespread and documented in post-war testimonies. The women who surrendered to Western Allied forces often learned of this contrast later through rumors, Red Cross reports, or returning civilians. Survival itself became evidence of chance, of geography, of which army arrived first. This disparity deepened the psychological impact of captivity under American control. It reinforced the sense that the world they had been taught to understand operated on rules they had never been allowed to see. The towel, the soap, the clean water, these were not universal features of defeat. They were products of a particular military culture at a particular moment, choosing order over vengeance. And it was within that choice that the true turning point of their captivity emerged. Because once the propaganda collapsed, once fear no longer governed expectation, the next phase began not defined by shock, but by realization. A realization that would reach its peak in the days immediately following that first processing line. The turning point did not arrive with a single dramatic gesture. There was no announcement, no confrontation, no release of tension through spectacle. Instead, it unfolded through repetition, through the steady rhythm of procedure carried out, again and again, until resistance, expectation, and fear quietly gave way. The women were called forward in small groups. Names were checked against lists. Identification numbers were issued and recorded. Each movement was directed, not rushed. The processing line advanced at a measured pace, designed to maintain control without panic. At the sanitation station, the rules were clear and impersonal. Uniforms bearing Nazi insignia were to be removed. Not folded, not stored, destroyed. This was not punishment. It was policy. Clothing associated with the regime carried lice, disease, and symbolism the system had no interest in preserving. Burn barrels were prepared at a distance from the line, their purpose explained without commentary. For many of the women, this moment carried more weight than their surrender. The uniform had been their last structure. Even in defeat, it had told them who they were. Removing it under supervision without ceremony, without choice, felt like stepping outside of history itself. Soap was issued next. Plain, unmarked bars. Towels followed. Rough, military standard. Water was cold, rationed, sufficient. There were no mirrors, no privacy beyond the minimal separation required by regulation. The process was exposed, but not voyeuristic, efficient, unemotional. Some women complied immediately. Training had taught obedience above all else. Others hesitated, hands clenched, eyes fixed on the ground. A few broke down quietly, tears absorbed into fabric that would soon no longer belong to them. Guards watched without expression, intervening only when movement stalled. What struck the women most was not what happened, but what did not. There were no insults, no laughter, no threats. The American personnel did not meet their eyes unless necessary. They did not speak beyond instructions. Their attention was on timing, sequence, compliance. This absence of hostility created a void where fear had been rehearsed for years. Into that void rushed something far more destabilizing than violence. Uncertainty. For the first time since their indoctrination began. The women could no longer predict what came next. The script they had memorized, the one that ended in brutality, had failed. And without that script, there was nothing to brace against. As uniforms disappeared into flames, some women stared openly, others turned away. A few clutched small items, buttons, scraps of fabric before being ordered to release them. Identity was being reduced to ash, not through cruelty, but through indifference. When the washing was complete, plain civilian clothing was issued. Dresses of unfamiliar cut, neutral colors. American manufacture, sizes chosen by estimation, not preference. There was no symbolism attached, no explanation offered. These garments were temporary, functional. The message was implicit. What they had been was no longer relevant. And yet, even now, the full weight of the moment had not settled. Because the true rupture did not come from the burning of uniforms or the loss of insignia, came from what followed, from the realization that nothing terrible was about to happen next. That realization would take hold slowly, inevitably, but once it did, it could not be reversed. The realization did not arrive all at once. It seeped in, minute by minute, carried by the smallest details. After washing, the women were directed toward temporary holding areas, benches, blankets, hot drinks. Not as a reward, not as reassurance, but because the processing schedule required it. The body needed to be stabilized before the next step. Hypothermia was a risk. Shock was inefficient. The system accounted for both. For many of the women, this was the precise moment the internal structure finally collapsed. They had been prepared for pain, for humiliation, for death. They had not been prepared for continuity, for the simple fact that the day was still moving forward, that the guards were checking watches, that trucks were arriving and leaving on schedule, that the world was not ending simply because their uniform no longer existed. Some began to shake uncontrollably, not from cold, but from delayed fear. Others sat in rigid silence, staring at their hands as if seeing them for the first time. A few whispered questions to one another, hesitant, fragmented, testing whether speech itself was now permitted. No one answered loudly. Habit still governed behavior. American medical personnel moved among them, observing for signs of distress severe enough to interfere with transport. Notes were taken. Pulse rates checked. Water offered again. The care was clinical, bounded by protocol. But for women raised on the idea that capture meant violation, even this neutrality carried emotional force. What they were experiencing was not relief. It was exposure, stripped of ideology, stripped of uniform. Stripped of the expectations that had sustained fear, they were confronted with an unbearable truth. The war they had believed in had ended, and the enemy they had been taught to hate was not performing the role assigned to him. Some women later described this moment as more frightening than combat. Because fear had direction, it demanded reevaluation of loyalty, of identity, of guilt. The absence of violence removed the final justification for resistance. There was no martyrdom available here, no heroic end, only survival carried out under observation in full consciousness. As the day progressed, names were called again, groupings adjusted, transport orders issued. The women were no longer a symbolic enemy. They were inventory, bodies, counted, documented, and moved according to need. That night, in barracks far from the processing yard, sleep came unevenly. Some women slept for the first time in days. Others lay awake, replaying the moment the towel had been placed in their hands, not because it was generous, but because it had been ordinary. Ordinary meant predictable. Predictable meant controllable. And controllable meant the world had not collapsed into chaos, as they had been promised it would. By morning, the burning barrels were cold, ashes scattered. No marker remained to indicate what had been destroyed. The women emerged into a routine that would repeat itself: roll calls, meals, work details until captivity. Itself became the new normal, but something irreversible had already occurred. The psychological war was over. What followed was not redemption or absolution, but consequence. A long, quiet reckoning that extended far beyond the fence. Into the months and years that followed, that reckoning would define what captivity meant and what survival would cost. By the days that followed, captivity settled into a rhythm. Not a gentle one, not a forgiving one, but a stable one. For women who had lived the final years of the war in constant motion, bombardment, and ideological tension, stability itself felt alien. Roll calls came first, morning and evening. Names spoken aloud, numbers checked, absences noted. Meals followed on schedule, simple, repetitive, nutritionally calculated: bread, soup, coffee, substitutes. Occasionally meat. For many of the women, it was more food than they had seen since 1943. Hunger, once a constant companion, retreated into memory. Housing varied by location. Some women remained in temporary European camps, housed in converted military barracks or requisitioned buildings. Others were transported westward, away from the ruins of Germany altogether. The journey itself by truck, train, or ship reinforced the reality of defeat more firmly than any lecture. The Reich had not merely fallen, it had been replaced in camps under American control. Discipline was enforced without spectacle. Work details were assigned based on ability and camp need. Laundry, kitchen assistance, maintenance, clerical tasks. Labor was not punitive. It was structured occupation, intended to prevent idleness and unrest. Payment, when issued, came in camp scrip or credits, usable only within the compound. Medical care continued, as protocol demanded. Illness was recorded. Pregnant prisoners received separate attention. Red Cross representatives conducted inspections, speaking privately with prisoners when possible, recording complaints, noting conditions. Their presence was a reminder that captivity was not invisible, that it existed within an international framework that extended beyond the fence. For the women, the psychological adjustment lagged behind the physical one. Many struggled with guilt not only for having survived, but for having been wrong. Wrong about the enemy, wrong about surrender, wrong about what honor required. The propaganda they had internalized had not simply misled them, it had shaped their sense of self. To discover that it was false created a vacuum where certainty once lived. Silence became common. Not enforced silence, but chosen. Conversations, when they happened, circled around practical matters, whether rations, schedules. Political discussion was rare. Belief had proven dangerous. Detachment felt safer. Some women clung to fragments of ideology, reframing humane treatment as deception or temporary strategy. Others abandoned belief entirely, adopting a posture of emotional neutrality. A few, often the youngest, began asking questions about the outside world, about the future, about whether returning home was even possible. Home itself had become an abstraction. Germany, when discussed, was described in rumors and fragments. Cities destroyed, families displaced, borders uncertain. The women understood that release would not mean restoration. It would mean return to a place that no longer resembled the one they had left. Yet captivity continued, day after day, without escalation. No revenge, no reckoning, no moral theater. This absence became its own weight, because without punishment, the past could not be resolved through suffering. Without cruelty, guilt could not be externalized. Survival demanded something more difficult than endurance. It demanded reflection. That reckoning would deepen in the months to come. As captivity extended beyond immediate necessity and into a prolonged, unresolved aftermath, and with it came the question none of them could avoid forever. What would remain of them once the fences finally opened? As the summer of 1945 stretched into autumn, the uncertainty of captivity replaced the shock of surrender. The war was over. Germany had capitulated. Europe was reorganizing itself in conferences and decrees far beyond the view of the camps. Yet for the women inside American custody, time seemed suspended in neither war nor peace, but an administrative pause. Repatriation did not come quickly. Unlike male POWs, whose labor was often immediately redirected toward reconstruction, female auxiliaries occupied an ambiguous category. They were not combat troops, but neither were they ordinary civilians. Files had to be reviewed, service records examined, political affiliations assessed. Each woman became a case number, a folder passed between desks. During this period, American policy shifted from containment to preparation. Educational programs were introduced in some camps. Lectures on democratic institutions. Screenings of documentary footage from liberated concentration camps, shown not as accusation, but as record. Reactions varied. Some women refused to watch. Others stared in silence. A few broke down, confronted with realities that propaganda had carefully excluded. Denazification questionnaire followed. Pages of questions, memberships, oaths, participation, knowledge. There were no perfect answers. Admission carried consequences. Denial invited scrutiny. The process was impersonal, but its effects were deeply personal. Identity, once declared through uniform and insignia, was now reconstructed through paperwork and testimony. Transfers continued. Some women were moved to camps in the United States, Arkansas, Texas, Arizona, far from any familiar landscape. The distance was disorienting. The geography itself reinforced the finality of defeat. Others remained in Europe, awaiting transport into occupied zones that were still being defined. Contact with family, when permitted, revealed the scale of loss. Letters described missing fathers, dead brothers, destroyed homes, entire towns erased. For some women, captivity had preserved their bodies, while everything they had known beyond the fence had been dismantled. When it came, was rarely ceremonial. Women were issued documents, small allowances, and directions. They were told where they could go, not where they wanted to. Trains carried them into shattered cities where housing was scarce and work uncertain. Former uniforms had been replaced with plain clothing, but the mark of service lingered. In some communities, association with the Nazi apparatus brought suspicion. In others, it brought silence. Many never spoke of captivity, again not because it had been brutal, but because it had been disorienting. The enemy they had feared had treated them with order. The ideology they had trusted had collapsed. The moral clarity promised by war had dissolved into administrative reality. For historians, these women often disappear from records shortly after release. They did not fit clean narratives of perpetrator or victim. Their experiences existed in margins, footnotes, camp rosters, Red Cross reports, yet their story marked a quiet turning point. It demonstrated that power could be exercised without spectacle, that victory did not require humiliation, and that the collapse of belief, when unaccompanied by violence, could be more destabilizing than defeat itself. The fences eventually came down, the camps emptied, life resumed, altered, and incomplete. but the memory of that first moment standing in line, handed soap and a towel by a supposed monster maid, because in that exchange, the war did not end with a gunshot, it ended with a contradiction.